right, Annie, hello. Okay, Annie.
You off before you start.
I know. All right. Before we even get started with this interview, I just want to gush for a bit because, so I heard you, as I mentioned in my email, I heard you on the Neurodivergent Woman podcast, which I'm a little bit obsessed with. And just, I was blown away. I was like, this woman is incredible. Who is this woman? And so I was just blown away. It was all about disordered eating and just hearing your story. And I just was so enamored. And I was like, I have to find out who Annie Crowe is. I found out about your podcast, started listening to your podcast. And just from the trailer alone, so, you know, in my introduction, I say my ADHD diagnosis turned my world upside down. And your trailer, you said, my autism and ADHD diagnosis turned my life right side up. And even just that alone, I was like, I have so much to learn from this woman, right? I just was like, oh, that's so buckle sweet. Up, right? I was like, buckle up, you were in for a ride. And sure enough, like I don't know. I don't know how to gush. I don't think I could ever possibly gush enough. I just find your podcast so enlightening and insightful. And I just feel like we are cut from the same cloth. And I feel like we're friends already. And so I feel like, well, and that's the thing is like, I would only say that because I know you've said that on your podcast too, where it's like, there's just people that you're just so drawn to. And I feel that with you. So I'm so excited 100%. That you even had heard of me, much less were willing to come on this podcast.
I feel like this is totally reversed. Like I'm the one fangirling because I've been listening to you for years, like literally since before my son was born in 2020. So I love what you say, and I love that you've quoted me because I'm totally going to quote you back at some point in this interview.
Awesome. Okay, so
thank you for inviting me.
I'm so glad excited. I found you, and I'm really excited, and I'm just hoping I don't screw this up and get all tongue-tied.
Oh, don't worry. That's what we do, but we do it with
I know, right?
Beauty and grace. Embrace it.
Okay, so let's start with, okay, so you had a PTSD diagnosis that really started all of this, and that was from a car accident, correct?
Yes, and a sexual assault, which is really not uncommon, especially for autistic women.
Was this in university?
90%. No, it was actually in my grad year working for the federal government in the public service. Yeah, on a work trip.
Okay. Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah, so and I'd only gotten married maybe 6 months earlier. Really, it shocked me. And then a year later, I was on stress leave after 2 years full-time work. And while I was on 6 weeks stress leave, I was in a really traumatic car accident.
Oh my God. Okay.
So I had a bit of a bad run, but like my whole life was sort of really hard already.
Right.
As most of us are already experiencing. So it was just like the icing on the cake. And that really started a whole thing. So when I went on stress leave, I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression, put on antidepressants, started seeing a psychologist for the first time in my life at 23, and I'm almost 32 now. So that's been like a decade. And it was then like another 4 years going in and out of every doctor, specialist under the sun, because I had a lot of physical injuries from the car accident as well. And seeing a bunch more therapists. I stuck with the first one for 2 years because I had no idea whether they were good or not. I just assumed that was what I was stuck with.
Right. That was my first psychiatrist too. She was god awful. She fell asleep during one of my sessions and I still didn't leave her. Anyway.
But this is my point. So I actually was looking at notes the other day from my old sessions, and like some of the stuff that she said to me, I'm like, how did I not see the red flags and go, I need to find someone better? But that's just kind of reflects how poor I trusted my own judgment and how much I internalized any problem that happened to me. I think that's also really common for our community. But anyway, now I have a great therapist who I still see weekly, and I don't think I'll ever stop, to be honest, which is a huge privilege, by the way, that not many people have access to. But I hope that I mean, this is why, I talk a lot about diagnosis and identity in my advocacy work and my coaching. And I am pro-diagnosis in the sense that if it's going to get you more support and if it's going to enable you to get the protections that you deserve under like disability discrimination and such, very important. But I'm also pro social model of disability and, embracing your neurodivergent identity, because I've learnt the hard way that fighting it will only really probably hurt you mostly. and only get you so far to an extent. But that's like a whole thing to unpack. Anyway, so then 4 years in, I kind of hit an end point of seeing pain specialists and having a few surgeries. And the last pain specialist I saw said, well, we can't do anything else. I think you should see a psychiatrist. And until that point, I'd only seen psychologists. So I went to see a psychiatrist and got diagnosed with PTSD. And when I started looking into PTSD, and by the way, I'm a military brat, so I grew up thinking PTSD was what people got from war and only weak people because stigma. And it's, obviously not, first off. But really, it was when I was researching PTSD that I started to see a link between traits of ADHD. And that made me then obviously deep dive into ADHD in women. And then I went into my GP and I said, I need to go see someone who specializes in this. I'm pretty sure I have it. So I was really, really lucky because she sent me to one of the most neuroaffirming psychiatrists in my probably country, to be honest. His books have been shut since just after I saw him, which sucks. And when I had my session, which was only like a couple months later, I did what many of us do, which is walk in with a binder tabbed up with like all this evidence of my life, which by the way is very autistic thing to do. Not saying that if you did that, you're autistic, but it is a very autistic thing to do. Constantly battling between executive function struggles and order and control.
Hyper organization. Yeah.
Yeah. It's hashtag my life. Anyway, so he did the big assessment on me, and at the end he's like, so what do you have? What do you think you have? And I was like, well, I've already been diagnosed with anxiety, depression, PTSD, and I'm pretty confident I have ADHD combined. And he's like, yeah, anything else? I'm like, is that a trick question? Legit, is that a trick question? And he was like, yeah, you're autistic. I'm like, what? I didn't even have anything to have preconceived notions about that. I didn't know what Rain Man was. I didn't know literally anything, which I think is a little bit of a blessing because I just had no judgment. I was just really curious to figure out, was he right, first off, which, considering he agreed that I had ADHD, I thought he's at least a little bit legitimate compared to a lot of women experiencing being gaslit by medical professionals who should know better because we can keep jobs or have marriages or whatever.
Insert positive trait here.
Insert ridiculous stigmatized stereotype here. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so then obviously I really, really, really started to explore autism as well as more ADHD, and now it's literally my job to help others do that. And yeah, I'm very autistic. I joke. I was writing an article the other day. I haven't published it yet, but I started the title with "I'm profoundly autistic," or "I have profound autism," because I'm very against functioning labels. And I can talk about that for days, but I would be what people consider high functioning autism, and I just don't really agree that that's a thing. So a lot of what I do, so the people I coach are mostly twice exceptional autistic ADHDers. So my course is autistic empowerment, and majority of them are women and non-binary autistic ADHDers who are also gifted. And it's a really, it's a bit of a niche, but also it's a complex area because giftedness is a really difficult topic. People really don't want to acknowledge giftedness. You know, you hear of like gifted and talented programs. Well, gifted and talented are very different things. You either, you know, and like giftedness isn't just intellectual either. You can be musically gifted, creatively gifted, intuitively gifted. There's so many types of giftedness. But really what twice exceptionality is when your said giftedness can mask and hide your disability. And so therefore, one, you don't really shine as much as you probably could. So maybe you weren't even identified as gifted, potentially, and usually you don't get disability support as well because you're not seen to be bad enough. And this is why I'm not for functioning labels, because the cost of that and the cost of masking and the capacity to mask, which masking is a privilege, that some people don't have access to. And it means that we are less discriminated in life because we can camouflage as neurotypical sometimes. So I got to acknowledge that first. But masking is also so harmful and damaging. And I still mask. I don't really think you can fully unmask in this world. So I'm not really for the whole unmask fully, but you definitely try to unmask as much as you feel safe. And that's different for everyone, and privilege comes into that a lot. But I promise I'll let you talk. I'm almost done. I feel like I've just been droning on at you already. But
I'm just taking notes.
Oh, nice. And now I've lost my train of thought. Standard. But giftedness, it's something to really, I think, that needs more attention, because we still need just as much support. And the outcome of not getting that support is having some of the highest rates of suicide and mental illness and shorter lives, poorer life outcomes, unemployment, underemployment, that it's so substantial. It may not be super obvious, or at least maybe they're not linking the reasons for that. And just to be clear, it's not the ADHD or autism that's causing it. It's the fact that society isn't set up to value or support our neurotype. And that's really the core of what I try and teach people, is that you need to understand all the systems you live within and how that impacts you. And it's actually really similar. I was reading your book the other day, which I'd owned for years, but I hadn't read yet. Yeah. Because I was like, I should probably catch up. I've always got 1,000 books on my book list.
I know,
the whole
right?
thing. Yeah, but it's actually, it correlates, like it aligns very closely to, body positivity or body acceptance, and, toxic diet culture and fat phobia. There's so many correlations, and that's another area that I do a bit of advocacy in, obviously, because I've done a lot in the eating disorder space, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But it's similar in your book, how you was talking about, that your life has just become so much easier since accepting your body and not continually trying to change it and fight it and hate yourself for your different body. It's very similar, but it's about our brain. It's invisible to an extent.
Well,
Anyway.
and another thing I think that was very parallel in terms of anti-dieting, my anti-dieting journey, and ADHD diagnosis, was this aha moment that I had around binge eating, which was that it was once I realized that binge eating was a disorder, right? It was like, this is not normal. I am not simply failing at being a good dieter. This is a disorder, and I am not the problem. The problem is the diet and what it's doing to my body, et cetera, et cetera. And once I had that moment of like, I'm not the problem here. I'm not failing at anything. My body is just doing a really good job at taking care of me. That was when I was able to really address like some of the systemic issues around dieting. And I feel like there's a lot of parallels there to a neurodivergent diagnosis of like, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not the failure here. It's the system around me that has failed me. And so I think there's so many parallels there with needing to have that like switch flipped in our brain about who's the problem, that we're not doing anything wrong here.
No,
we have been
absolutely.
failed.
Yeah, because and that's the kind of the system we live in, is that we're pathologized and the fault's put on us and not the world around us. But I mean, it's interesting, even the language you use there, because really what failed you wasn't your disordered eating. It was diet culture and the society you live in and the standards you're held to. And that's similar with neurotypical or neuronormative values and behaviors, isn't it? Yeah. That's the problem. It wasn't really your eating. And also the things that led you to binge eat is more often than not, and this isn't spoken about enough, is that most people who binge eat tend to be the ones that are chronic dieters. And if you think about how our bodies are made in terms of, caveman and starving and hunger and famine, if you are forcing your body to continually go into a famine, the reaction to that is generally going to be a feast.
Right.
So I actually thought I had binge eating issues for years, because when doctors and health professionals saw me, they made assumptions and didn't question anything of my behavior deeper. And because I ate more than maybe what some would consider average occasionally, that was a tick in the box for binging. But really, I only did that after a significant portion of time starving myself. And my diagnosis was atypical anorexia, which I think the word atypical needs to be thrown in the bin, because 96%, I think 94, 96, something like
94%, yeah.
94% of us are atypical. How is that an atypical thing? But that's fat phobia within the diagnosis. Because you're only not atypical if you're underweight, which is ridiculous, because you can be just as medically compromised in a large body, starving yourself. So yeah, that's discrimination 101.
Right. And the behaviors that are pathologized in a thin body are encouraged in a larger body when it comes to eating.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, don't get me started.
Me neither. This can be a rant sesh. But therapeutic though.
Right? Oh gosh. Okay. So wait, I had some notes about the gifted stuff too, because it was, there's so much there in terms of, I was in the gifted program, and that's where I feel like that's where it all started unraveling for me in terms of the, having these higher expectations and not living up to them, and being told I had all this potential and I wasn't meeting this potential. And so a couple friends of mine who I'm sure now every one of them is neurodivergent. We had a club called the Gifted Underachievers because we didn't know how to deal with with the fact that we did so poorly, and we kept waiting to get kicked out of the program, and we never did. And so we just started skipping class, and it was just like, there's just all of that feeling of just, that we had truancy issues because we couldn't handle being such underachievers, and like what that said about us and our sense of self-worth was so damaging.
So damaging.
And so I feel like even just this idea of telling children that they have potential is just damaging, at least to a neurodivergent brain. And I think that's where it's interesting. I remember seeing like a tweet once about how telling telling a neurotypical child or a certain type of child that they have potential may actually encourage them, and it may actually be something that they need to hear in order to get them to push themselves. But for another certain type of child, it's actually really, really damaging.
Terrifying.
And I thought that was right. And so I thought that was interesting to be like, how do we even be able to realize how important language is to certain types of thinkers at such a young age? Like, it almost feels like we were screwed from the beginning.
Yeah. And then you add demand avoidance in, and the minute you feel like there's any perceived pressure of achieving, that can be complicated. But I think something that's not often talked about enough in that, because I've got a very similar experience to you, wasn't in a gifted and talented, but my school didn't particularly have one, but I did the top extension advanced maths. So all my friends were nerds, and most of them are doctors and engineers. And I was always like pretty solid A- student. And so I thought I was constantly failing because all my friends were A+ students, which is kind of like the thing that I think is really important to highlight in the achievement aspect and everything that you just explained, and why we feel that way, is that if you're a gifted child, you learn from a very young age, whether this is blatantly pointed out to you or just implied, that your gifted mind is incredible or valued or amazing. And a lot of us attach our identity to that. So the minute we start to struggle, which everyone eventually does, it can be really earth-shattering. And then on top of that, create a lot of imposter syndrome and disillusionment and self-loathing, so many complicating factors, because, one minute you think you're a smart kid and you're told you're a smart kid, or, it's pretty obvious to you that you're pretty quick or whatever it is. But the next minute you're really struggling, and you're told when you struggle that it's your choice, that you're just not applying yourself, or you're being lazy, or you're not living up to your potential. Like all the things that we're told. But I love the saying, all behavior is communication, and kids do well when they can, because I think that really, if anyone ever struggles in school, gifted or not, it's not a choice. It's rarely a choice. I don't even think it is ever actually a choice. And if it's a choice, it's a choice as a consequence to their experience and how they're being treated. And I don't think that is really highlighted enough.
And not only Well, not only that, but that's where I think there's a real gender divide in terms of how children are supported, because I think that oftentimes in a classroom, if a boy is struggling or having, some of these hyperactive, typical ADHD behaviors, the response is, we need to diagnose this boy, we need to help him, we need to support him. Whereas oftentimes the response to girl having similar behaviors is, it's a character flaw, you need to figure it out, you need to discipline her, right? And so I feel like there's a gender divide even in the earliest classrooms in terms of where support is built in to the male experience so much more, whereas women are supposed to be the support system, so we need to figure it out on our own. There's not we're not being catered to in the way that men are at such an early age.
Yeah, it's a huge from birth. I think that gender gap grows, but it's interesting because I think that it's just left my mind, it'll come back. This is standard. What was it? Talking about like gender and how we're treated differently. I think for gifted learners or gifted humans, because so much of giftedness is spoken about in terms of schooling, but there's a lot of gifted adults that are still around and getting no help,
right? Yeah,
or support. Is really that I think you're held to a higher standard, and I'm not saying that a lot of this stuff is hard to talk about because it sounds so stuck up or whatever, but it's like one of the things that I got early in therapy, and to an extent still do from some people, is lower your standards, lower your expectations, you're a perfectionist, blah 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 blah. I'm like, I was literally raised that way, like, because I was gifted in certain areas, everyone then assumed I would be like that in all areas, which is just never really how it is, isn't it? Like they say a lot of twice exceptional kids have a spiky profile. So we're really good at some things, but we really struggle with others. And a lot of those things we don't get help for or acknowledgement. So one of the things that, I spoke early, very, very early, but I read not late, but I struggled with reading. I actually started school a year early. Because daycare's like, she's bored, and I got bullied by the big girls. And I was, my parents went into the parent-teacher interview, and the teacher said, oh, she's a little bit behind her peers in reading. They're like, she's like over a year younger than the youngest person in your class. And she was like, oh, I forgot. Like, of course. But, I did struggle with reading. I still do struggle with reading. And now I'm realizing that's a lot to do with my multiple neurodivergencies. But, when I was quick to speak and I'm quite articulate, even when I'm in a meltdown, I can be really articulate sometimes. And that makes people think that I'm consciously choosing how I'm reacting, which is absolutely not what's happening. But in that articulate nature, or, I was called like a wise little girl, or, a far beyond my years, blah, 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 all those things. Adults then expect you to be that in every way. But I emotionally and socially, I really struggled, and it's like they didn't want to acknowledge that because my intellect was the only thing that they saw. And that's sort of where I guess the autism comes in. And I know one of the things you were keen to talk about is the difference between ADHD and autism, which is
oh my God,
a fun topic.
Well, I almost envy the fact that you got your diagnoses together, because it's like, if you follow the trajectory of my podcast, right? It's like it starts out and I'm like, oh my God, ADHD, let's talk about ADHD. This is ADHD, this is ADHD, blah, blah, blah. And then like about a year into the podcast, I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Are we actually talking about autism here? And I just like did this 180 where I was like, okay, how do we even begin to decide which is which? Because, a lot of it was the generally feeling very confused. And like, I know you've talked about this on your podcast too, like how it's ADHD is the gateway diagnosis, because a lot of us start to, we start to talk about like the, all of the sensory issues and stimming and rejection sensitivity. And it's like, wait a minute. And then somebody who is autistic will say, you're actually talking about autism. And so then it's like, well, wait a minute. Am I being ableist by talking about this from a framework I'm comfortable talking about it with it, which is I've been diagnosed with ADHD and this is my lived experience? Am I being ableist by not acknowledging or looking more into the fact that this could actually be autism? Is there an overlap, or and so are these experiences that both people can have, or is this really just like, even the term neurodivergent, which is something I'm much more comfortable with because I'm like, I don't know. I'm basically self-diagnosed at this point. I do not have an official diagnosis of autism, but it's like there's so much. I mean, even just like the autism self-exam, which I go down these rabbit holes where I start taking autism self-tests. And there's the one that makes me laugh so hard is the autism spectrum quotient test, which is it's so problematic. I have so many problems with this test, and the test says if you get 26
that's
or
a very
higher,
autistic thing,
exactly right.
To have many problems.
Well, and not only, so I'm like,
I love it.
So the first time I took the test, it said if you get 26 or higher, you're probably autistic. So I got 26, and I was like so angry. I was like, this is not helpful. And then I'm like going through these questions, and I'm like, I am fascinated by numbers is one of the questions, and I'm like, what kind of number? What do you mean? I don't look at the number
in what
3
scenario?
and get fascinated, but did I try to memorize 100 decimal places of pi when I was a kid? Sure. So I'm like, that's a terrible question. And then it was like, I enjoy meeting new people, and I'm like, well, what kind of people? Is it what time of day is it? Have I eaten?
I feel like the main question of those tests need to be at the end. Did you get frustrated with the vagueness of these questions?
No, right? And so and then the other one was like, there's another one too where it was like, I'm not very good at remembering people's dates of birth. And I was like, well, I remember my date of birth, and the people who are important to me, I remember their dates of birth, but I'm not going to remember some random person. So every single question I was deconstructing and so angry with. And then I was like, yes, okay, this is the test right here. Like, this is it. Yeah. But I still haven't like had any and getting a diagnosis is so difficult that I'm sort of like, I'm at that place right now where I think a lot of neurodivergent women are, which is like, how important is it for me to get that? I really wish I had it because I know how important the ADHD diagnosis has been for me, but my ADHD is keeping me from pursuing the diagnosis because it's so complicated.
That's a huge problem. Right? Executive functioning needing to even get access to diagnosis and care is just ridiculous.
Right. And so, but I'm starting to wonder if the term neurodivergent is a cop-out, if it's like a whitewashing of are we just afraid of autism, and so we're steamrolling over autism with these generalized terms. So I was curious what you think, and like how do you even, when you've given the diagnosis together, does it feel like it's clearer for you to delineate between the two?
No.
Okay.
No, it's taken me years of reading, watching, and listening to everything under the sun, and doing a lot of deep thinking and reflection, and I'm still not really at a solid answer. So if you figure that out,
that is not helpful, Annie.
No, but I am. I think I have a little bit more clarity that hopefully might help you. I hope. And I'm not a medical professional, so take it with a grain of salt. Not that I think you need to be, because I've met many of them that are not great.
Right. Well, exactly.
Anyway, we won't go there. I've also met some good ones. I'm not anti-healthcare. So where do we start with that? Getting both was a huge privilege and so rare to start off with. And I am so grateful for that. One of my good friends, Alana, who was on my episode, I think it was 2 or 3, Talks Too Much Meets Her Match. So she wrote a book called Talks Too Much. Yeah, it's a great book, by the way. Recommend. Very easy to read. Actually, similarly to yours, quite an ADHD friendly read in terms of not too like bulky and boring, and you know what I mean? Anyway,
I love
our
dopamine
that,
brain. Right? Yeah, because it was written before my diagnosis, so I'm always like, it's not officially an ADHD book, but it's so clearly an ADHD book. But it's your style,
book, right? Yeah, exactly. It is. But she's fantastic, and she reached out to me when I was first starting my podcast, and I think I was reaching out to a couple of Facebook groups I was on, saying, anyone want to come on? And she was like, yeah, me, and I'll give you a free copy of my book. And I'm like, what's your book? And she's like, it's this. I'm like, oh, I already own it. And I started reading it because it came out like 2 months earlier. And I always troll for whatever's coming out. And yeah, it's a passion. It's my special interest or hyper focus or whatever you want to call it. As I'm sure many of us are when we get diagnosed and want to figure it all out. But so I read her book as we were chatting and talking about her coming on my show, and I got about a third of the way through it, and I said to her, because we were sending each other like voice notes, and I said, are you autistic? Because of course I'm autistic and blunt like that sometimes. And she said, well, I think I might be. And I was like, well, I'm pretty sure you are. And then she went through this like crisis of confidence, and she was like, oh, I've written this book and I haven't even and it's been all about ADHD, and now I'm realizing some of it's autism or maybe even just overlaps. And anyway, I was like, don't worry. It's going to be a great book for many women that are diagnosed with ADHD before they realize that autism is a thing, if it is for them. And I'm not, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that it's not clear or that you're focused on one or the other. Like, whatever works for you, whatever you need to get access to the world and have a more thriving life than being in some constant survival mode. Like, you do you. But she's now writing her second book, and she's now been officially diagnosed as autistic, which is awesome. But yeah, I just love that story because happens all the time, I think, in our community, where people are like, maybe.
Right. I know.
But I was actually interviewed on one of our national television programs, The Project, in December. And it was a little segment on social media and ADHD and autism diagnosis. And it was quite funny because they used me as the segue from the doctor saying that there's so much misinformation on TikTok to me being like, I don't think it's a problem. If it's going to be a difference between people going and seeking answers and help, good on them.
Right? Yeah.
And also, it's a direct result of a lack of information from the healthcare community, right? Like, we're not all online sharing our experience because we just want to. It's because we all know how hard it is to find these answers and to find the truth that isn't just a very pathologized, traumatized view, stereotyped view of autism and ADHD. And I say to a lot of women and non-binary, because there's a huge amount of them in our community as well. We're very gender diverse. If you do take any autism tests, take them with a big grain of salt, because as a assigned female at birth, you will score lower just because of your gender and your lived experience. So generally, I recommend for people to go to the Embrace Autism website and do the CAT-Q test, which is the camouflaging test. Because that can be quite helpful, because if you're getting not very high on the autism scores, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not autistic. It just means that they're based on evidence of mostly cis white male boys.
Okay, I'll put a link to the in the show notes to that one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, it's the kind of the best we got right now. But that stuff's growing, the understanding of it. So if you're talking about autism versus ADHD, and it's funny because there's so many ADHD coaches out there, and there's so many people that are solely focused on ADHD, which is great. But sometimes online I get attacked. Not very often, thank God. But occasionally when I'll say something like autism is more stigmatized than ADHD, I get a couple of ADHDers going, oh, are you kidding? ADHD is so stigmatized. And it is. Absolutely. Like, the fact that people don't think it's real, that we're just lazy, all those things, very, very much true. But in terms of a sort of belonging aspect, or whether you're comfortable saying that you have it, autism is usually harder in terms of people accepting that you have it, especially because of the social aspect. So when you think of ADHD, you think distractibility, hyperactivity. You don't necessarily think that much about social challenges. I mean, many ADHDers have social challenges, and we'll get into that. But autism is often seen as someone who can't have friends, can't talk, will make eye contact, blah, 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 which is not really what autism is. And that totally misses the point. But I can understand why people think that they're not that because generally we're not. So what I like to tell people is the diagnostic criteria is really just a summary of autistic ADHD people who are in crisis. It's not a true summary of what it is to be an autistic ADHD or one or the other. A lot of the behaviors that it talks about is either us experiencing trauma or us being judged from a lens that is not correct or affirming. So I like to talk about the social deficits category in ASD, and how, we have autistic people have social quote unquote deficits. And so there's now lots of research coming out in the last few years about a thing called double empathy problem. The double empathy problem was coined in the UK, I think, about a decade ago. And basically, I like to explain this in a really tacky way, but like, just bear with me. So they took this group of autistic people, and then they took this group of non-autistic people, and each group separately had to do kind of like a Chinese whispers type thing, where they sent one message through and then saw how accurate it was at the end. And then they put a group in the middle and they mixed it half and half autistic, half allistic, non-autistic, neurotypical, whatever you want to call it. And when they looked at all the results of these three groups, the group that was all autistic and the group that was all non-autistic got almost the same score in accuracy. And the group in the middle that was two completely different neurotypes botched it. Yet we are told we have social deficits, but really the fact that the social norms are based on neurotypical social behaviors is the only reason it's seen as a deficit. And the reality is that we do live in a society where that is the dominant social culture, right? Mm-hmm. So it is still challenging. And when I talk about this stuff, I don't negate the fact that we struggle and it is hard. I guess I try to help people understand trying to separate or thinking that it's the autism that's the problem and understanding the systems, society, and bias of the world that you live in, right? So and another thing is a gender aspect as well. So women tend to be high masking, tend to be much more social. So, you know, eye contact is usually not a big thing for us. I mean, maybe we don't like it or we avoid it, but some of us can easily make it and have forced ourselves to, even if it doesn't feel natural. We also talk, so a lot of, have you heard of PDA? Pathological demand avoidance, or as I prefer, persistent drive for autonomy, which is much nicer.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. Some people use pervasive, but I still think that's super pathologizing. PDA is really a very new area of understanding, and it's referred to as the PDA profile of autism, but I question whether that's an autism-specific thing, because I know a couple of ADHDers that I'm pretty confident aren't autistic that have a very PDA profile. And by that, I mean a very demand avoidant.
I was going to say, I always just called myself oppositional, and always used to joke that I would have been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder had it existed in the 80s when I would have been diagnosed with it. But I'm like, I've always had demand avoidance, and I am extremely oppositional with certain people. So yeah, that's how I always coined it for myself, but it's the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And also, so PDA is, sorry if you can hear my dog. I think I'm getting a post delivery.
Oh, is that yours? I thought it was mine, actually. It's fine.
No, oh, good. No, it's totally yours. Just pretend. No, so PDA is also very often talked about from people who are, and this isn't a bad thing or anything. It's more just, I think, an acknowledgement that it's much more varied, similarly to autism and ADHD, in how it can show up for people. But it's usually talked about people who are a little bit more oppositional and defiant outwardly so. And I actually grew up being not like that. I was a good little girl. I was teacher's pet. I was very much a fawn response kind of gal. And don't get me wrong, I was oppositional and avoidant in every way, but it was always behind closed doors, and I used really tricky little techniques to get out of things or avoid things. And the only people who saw the real defiance were probably my parents and poor brothers and now husband.
Yeah.
But yeah, PDA, I think, can you still hear him?
Sure. It's fine. Yeah.
He's a butthead. Anyway, but yeah, so what were we talking about? ADHD and autism. So I like to kind of, I mean, and so in terms of the evolution of my own thought process on this is really, because there was quite a long time where I would talk to my therapist and say, oh, do you think this is the autism or ADHD? And she'd be like, does it matter? I'm like, yes, it matters. I like systemizing and categorizing and black and white and knowing what's what. Like, yes, it matters. But, and I still think it matters, to be honest. But I also think that what's more important is focusing on access and focusing on what you want to be and who you are. So when I say that, I don't necessarily mean not focusing on the differences, because it is a thing. But in my mind, they're blurred so together these days, just because the majority of people I meet are both. The stats coming out are something like as high as 70% overlap. I think we'll hit a day where they won't be separate. I'm not sure that I'd call it like a neurodivergent spectrum or anything. I don't even like the term spectrum for autism, because I'm like, we don't say there's a neurotypical spectrum, but they're just as diverse as autistic people. Like, it just seems silly. Anyway, but I do think that it's very much a product of the pathologizing realm that we live in, trying to put our brains in boxes of symptoms, quote unquote, rather than acknowledging that different brain wiring like ours can just be traits and characteristics, and they come in different forms. And on the topic of neurodivergent, I actually really like that term, mostly because what it means is, one, I don't have to pick a name or say a bunch of names of what my diagnoses are. And two, it doesn't allow for assumed stereotypes and stigma as much as if you were to say to someone, I have ADHD or I'm autistic, and then either be like, oh, no, you're not, which is so invalidating and horrible, or to say like, oh yeah, but you're high functioning or something. Like, either way, it's not very nice.
Right.
Not that it's intended badly, but I like neurodivergent because it almost forces the external people to then question, well, what's your neurodivergence? And not in terms of what are the labels, but what does it look like for you? Because even within just autism and ADHD, we can be so different. I mean, let's just focus on sensory for a second, which absolutely fits more in autism, but ADHDers have sensory differences as well often.
Do we, or is it really autism?
Well, depends who you ask. I think every human has sensory differences. And I think that's something that makes it hard for people to understand when you're more away from the norm and that it's a thing. Yeah. But in terms of it being substantial sensory challenges and differences, I think that's definitely more of an autism thing. But even within that itself, you know, we have 8 senses. Most people don't even know that. And we can be hyper and hyposensitive within even one of those. And so people think, oh, autism can't deal with light, noise, sound. No, noise and sound are the same thing. Smell, taste, all that stuff, proprioception, interoception. But it's more complicated than that. And so I guess the thing I like about neurodivergent is you can't make an assumption. And I mean, end goals for me is that we get to a point where we don't need to be relying on specific labels for people to get access and the help they need to fit in a world that is not made for them. But, you know, we're not there yet. We're going that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a conversation I have a lot, you know, now that I'm going back to school to become a mental health counselor. And so it's a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about and thinking about in terms of the wellness model in therapy and how I find it really antithetical to a neurodivergent diagnosis and the importance of diagnosis. And so there's a real reluctance to diagnose. There's a real reluctance to pathologize in mental health counseling. And I'm like,
that's ableist.
Right. And exactly. And I'm like, it is incredibly important to diagnose because we don't view a diagnosis as pathological. So it's like the diagnosis is information. It's how we can categorize who we are and why we do what we do. So
it's how we can articulate that to the world and advocate for our needs.
Exactly.
Right?
And validate ourselves. And so it gives us permission to advocate for ourselves and to seek accommodation in a way that is so important. And so when I hear these things like, oh, well, everybody is on a spectrum of anxiety or something, you know, all these issues where it's like, we're all humans and we all are neurodivergent in our own way. That's where I start to get really worried about terms that are almost too overarching, where I'm like, are we starting to just whitewash some of these really, really important identities? And that's where I feel like neurodivergent is a great term also, because I do feel like it like, I loved how you articulated it, which is like, it gives that opening to say like, well, how do you present? What are some of your traits, right? Like, what is your experience? And so I think within the community, it's really, really important, but I'm also sort of worried that it's going to just be like, well, everybody's neurodivergent, right? Like sort of in a way that's going to end up,
I think that's
making it difficult.
It is happening already, I think. That is a huge risk. And I think in terms of ableism, which I didn't really talk about, but ableism is such a big one. And ableism, it's really about thinking deeply about what's behind the things that are said. So do you avoid the term autism or ADHD or autistic because you think they're bad, which is often why many people will say, oh, you're not that, because I see that as such a bad thing. That's ableist. Mm-hmm. Or do you want to use neurodivergent, not because you don't want to say that you're autistic or ADHD, because you've embraced them and you accept that that's who you are, but because you're sick of other people making assumptions about what that means. And if you use this other term, they just don't have access to making those ignorant comments and not very informed judgments, right? Mm-hmm. So yes and no. I mean, it's not a clear answer in terms of, I don't necessarily think just putting everyone in neurodivergent is potentially the option, but I think it's a safety net. Like many people who struggle with mental illness, which is a type of neurodivergence, but it's acquired and not born with, like ours is. I also have that too. So that's super stigmatizing. You go into a workplace and you have PTSD or anxiety or depression. Just being able to articulate that and get accommodations for those things, because some of them are permanent and some like we have a disability insurance scheme in Australia, and some people on that have psychosocial disabilities where they have, permanent PTSD or permanent long-term chronic anxiety or whatever. And that is, I think, really hard to get help for, because as we know with mental health and stigma, it's like, well, just choose better and do better. And if you do these things, you won't have this anymore. And it's easier as an autistic ADHD to go, well, let me tell you, I'll still be autistic and ADHD, even if I do everything in my power to change that. But it's harder to say I'll still be traumatized or anxious if I do everything to fix that, right? So I think neurodivergent, can be a safety net for mental health as well, because you don't necessarily have to divulge what your neurodivergence is. And I say to people who do say those comments around everyone's different, everyone's diverse, everyone's neurodivergent, which I think they are really meaning well and trying to be inclusive, but they don't realize the implications that it's super invalidating, and they've totally missed the point, is that neurotypical doesn't mean typical in the sense that there's a normal. It just means that there's this group that have a certain amount of neurological characteristics that are seen as the dominant and prioritized and valued characteristics of brains in this world. And that doesn't mean that they don't struggle with things, because we all do, we're human, right? Neurodivergent is just to the extent that brains diverge from that norm, that group, that cohort. So the more divergent your brain is, the more likely you are actually neurodivergent and not just neurotypical and human. Like, you're neurodivergent and human, obviously, but like neurotypical and don't have access needs and don't have barriers in society that your brain not creates, but has because society doesn't put your brain first. It's just like if everyone was in a wheelchair, you wouldn't be disabled if you were a wheelchair user, right? Because society would be made for wheelchair users. But wheelchair users are disabled because society is not made for them and they need accommodations. So a lot of what I do, especially in the advocacy space, trying to teach the non-autistic world and the non-ADHD or neurotypical world, is trying to help them understand what is accessibility for neurodivergent people. So the term that I use is neuroaccessibility. And the reason I've heard it used in like brain science before, but I've never heard it used in like a social justice, political way. So I just kind of coined it myself. I don't know if someone else has defined it, but I couldn't find it. So I've just said it's basically about defining accessibility needs for neurodivergent people. And so what that means is like, needing supports for executive functioning, needing social accommodations or adjustments, needing sensory support, but none of that's visible. And a lot of the time when we advocate for those things, we're told that they're not real, or they don't believe us, or they're not going to take us at our word, and we need a bunch of medical people to write a bunch of reports to prove it, which is super horrible and inaccessible. But a lot of the stuff I do on the side, for those who don't know my background, I am a lawyer. I'm just not practicing these days, but I still keep up to date and very much am across disability rights and human rights law. And so a lot of my work supporting autistic ADHDers in the workplace who are very heavily discriminated against is to help them articulate what their needs are and try and get them met, because so often they're not. And often we're too scared to ask. And even when we do ask, we're not believed. I actually quite often get contacted from Americans who want me to talk to their lawyers, or lawyers who want me to explain what it is, because it's still like, I mean, obviously we're all out here going, we're trying to figure it out. You can imagine lawyers who have no mental health or medical training are trying to do as well. So I kind of fit this weird middle zone of, I've done both. Like, I'm not medically trained, but like I've had to figure it out myself so I can at least articulate it to those people. And I hope that in the future we head to a place where it's not so unclear and we have much clearer guidelines of what does it mean to need accessibility adjustments as a neurodivergent person. Anyway, end rant.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Right. Well, even just this idea that like accommodations are so that you can be at your best, and wouldn't everybody want you to be at your best? But I think we still frame it, and we still sort of have this internalized ableism around accommodations, which is like, I'm trying to get away with something. I'm looking for handouts. I'm trying to get a shortcut. And so all of the masking that has involved like trying to show up as somebody who is totally doesn't need help and is purely capable is keeping us from feeling like accommodations are going to help us be our best selves, and that just is common sense. But I think it's like
Absolutely.
It's a semantic issue that we have to get over in terms of just asking it for accommodations in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also why, like, I don't really like the whole superpower thing. I think it's like toxic positivity. If that's what floats your boat, you say that you have a superpower, cool. But it's just not my jam. But at the same time, I do like to move away from the negative stuff. I don't believe that in order to have access that you need to sell your struggles, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is, for example, in Australia, we have a thing called the NDIS, which is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And it's only been up and running for, I think it was 2013, so maybe a decade now, but it's still really early days. And ADHD is not included, but our autism is, which is so problematic. But in order to get help, regardless of your autism diagnosis, you need to prove basically how broken you are and how not functioning you are. And they're slowly starting to, no, well, they're not, but I think practitioners are very much starting to realize how horrible it is to have to constantly write reports about how horribly not coping their clients are just to get funding. And so I think there's a middle ground here of and this is kind of what I'm writing in my book, which is actually called Neuroaccessibility. And my ACCESS acronym is one of the elements of that is evaluation. And what that means is not like just finding out where you're broken and where you need help. It's actually doing a full profile of where your strengths are, because regardless of if you're quote unquote gifted or not, everyone has strengths, right? And everyone has challenges. It's just usually, if you're neurodivergent, it's to a different level in one way or the other, or both, whatever. So really it's about acknowledging both and figuring out how can we let your strengths shine and exist and not be like hidden or masked or ignored because we're solely focusing on helping your challenges, while at the same time acknowledging that you do have those challenges and doing things to help make them easier and help you access employment, education, and healthcare and life. It's really not that hard when you think about it like that, right? But it's just not really spoken about. Sorry, that's my phone alarm to remind me to eat lunch.
Oh my God, I can't believe it's been an hour already. Oh my goodness.
I know. That we can sort of talk for a bit. That goes off every day because otherwise I forget to eat. Anyway, but that's an accommodation that I need, right? And so actually this is something I really, really wanted to talk about because it's one of my most passionate areas, is that there is nothing to be ashamed of in needing help. And I spent the first few years after I was diagnosed, which was pre-COVID, doing everything I could to fix myself and to be less autistic and ADHD. And, leaning into the therapies, leaning into early intervention in all ways. I saw speech pathologists, OTs, psychologists, everyone. And I'm telling you, as much as I tried my best, it didn't do a lot. I got a couple of benefits from it, but not a lot.
Well, that's one thing.
What helped is acknowledging that, how about we just know that this is who we are and actually start focusing on our energy on figuring out strategies and services that can help support those gaps. And that has changed my life. And that is why for the last year and a bit, I have been everywhere. If people look me up, you'll probably see a lot. I'm actually I'm sure people are going to stop asking me to come on podcasts soon because I'm on too many. I get too many offers, which is so nice, but also I'm not fixed. I haven't figured out how to deal with my ADHD or autism. I haven't hacked it. I've literally just embraced the chaos and put lots of systems and strategies in place to help me live. Mm-hmm. It's just that simple. And it's not that simple. It's so hard and it takes so long to get there. But it's, again, similar to your book and diet culture, and just the minute you stop fighting, the minute you literally reject diet culture and stop trying to shrink your body, the freedom that it allows you to not hate yourself and to accept yourself and to maybe give yourself access to things like comfortable clothes or clothes that fit properly, or doing things that you said you wouldn't do until you lost the weight. There's a lot of correlations in the neurodivergent space and what we hold ourselves to and what we allow ourselves to do and judge ourselves for. Anyway.
Well, and I would, one of the things I think autism diagnoses have going for them, if that's the right terminology, is the fact that autism is embraced almost from the get-go in terms of an identity and a way of being that isn't automatically how can we fix this? I mean, obviously there's outliers like ABA, but it's...
Well, not for adults anyway.
Right?
They're you're too far gone as an adult. They want to fix the kids and do early intervention on autistic kids.
Maybe this is...
But not adults.
Maybe this theory is falling apart.
No, it's true.
But I think that I think ADHD
totally
is
valid.
often presented in a way which is oh, now that I know what's wrong with me, how can I fix it?
I can fix
it. How can I be normal?
Absolutely.
And I get so many women who come to me with coaching, which is help me be that version of myself I was before I burnt out. And I'm do you really want to be that person? You fucking burnt out.
I know,
let's
right?
figure out how to not be that person.
Yeah.
So I think there's a real difference there in terms of the radical acceptance element that I think exists more within the autism community, and just is worked into maybe the person first language. I feel it's woven into that identity a lot more than it is with ADHD, because ADHD, there's all of that.
I completely agree.
The ADHD coaches too that are just we'll hack your ADHD and we're going to master productivity and we're going to do it. And you're just shut up. But
we're going to fix your executive functioning challenges. Woo.
I know. And I'm all right, that's a different tangent for another day. Now I do.
Or you will, and then you'll burn out.
Well,
and have consequences.
Right. Or you're going to figure out a way to have your environment work for you. That's what it's not about, jamming yourself.
It's all about
into,
changing the external.
Right. Yeah. Now I do want to pivot a bit, because one of the things I haven't actually talked a lot about on this podcast, so I wanted to get your opinion about it, was Ehlers-Danlos, which is it's something I don't know a lot about, but I know the hypermobility and Ehlers-Danlos is very common. There is a lot of overlap with autism. And why is it common? Because it seems to me like it is not, it's not neurological, right? Or is it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I'm not a doctor, but it's actually also more common in ADHD, just not quite as much or known. The link's just starting to be noticed more.
Or is it really autism?
Well, or are we all three? Who knows? No, so, and there's mixed opinions on this, but some people, so Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, there's 14 types, first off. and most of them can be tested genetically. But the main one that most people have, which is hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which I have, is not able to be tested genetically. It's like a diagnosis of basically eliminating everything else, similar to fibromyalgia, right? To making sure there's nothing else that can explain the similar symptoms or whatever. Anyway, but it's very genetic. My mum also is EDS, and so is her father. And I'm not saying that's why it's genetic. The studies show it's genetic. I'm just saying it's genetic in my family, obviously. But so is autism and ADHD.
I love your mom, by the way. That episode is so good.
She's great, right? She was so nervous. So cute. And yeah, so they're all very genetic. And some people, some researchers have even started to say, and I'm not sure how popular this is yet or whether it's actually going to develop into anything, but they've even talked about how potentially having Ehlers-Danlos, which is basically a connective skin tissue disorder, if you want to call it a disorder. It's just our connective tissue is different. It's more stretchy or hypermobile, fluid, whatever, malleable. And then we have issues with like joints and pains and dislocations and all of that. But again, there's 14 types, so they're all different. And it's similar to like, I think of it like, ADHD, you've got combined, inattentive, hyperactive. There's 3 types, right? Mm-hmm. But even within those types, there's so much diversity, similar in Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. But obviously it's a physical thing. Yeah. So people will talk about how that connective tissue difference can affect brain development. And, some people will talk about autistic brains being hyperconnected and very intense with a very turned on nervous system. And some people are starting to think maybe there's something there with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or EDS.
Okay, that makes sense.
I don't know. Who knows? I'm very much observing what's coming out, but it is very, very common. And I actually only found out that I had HEDS after and through that same psychiatrist that told me I was autistic, because some of the stuff that came up in my big assessment were a lot of issues that I had with chronic pain and joint issues and all of those things that he was sort of like, oh, I should probably mention this. And it's funny because I've spent my whole life having these problems and seeing many, 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 many physios and doctors. And from a very, very young age, I was told I was hypermobile, but then it was like nothing else. It was just like, it's an interesting fact about you. Like, you have brown hair. Cool. And no one ever said there's this thing called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and some people who are hypermobile are also EDS. You can just be hypermobile without EDS, of course. And there is HSD, hypermobile disorder syndrome or something. I don't know, whatever. There's another one that's just hypermobility disorder. It's all pathologizing.
Go Google it.
Whatever. Yeah, go Google it. Not a doctor. But it just blows my mind that even though I had a lot of these obvious things now that I understand being connected to EDS, and it was never, ever raised. But I think that also kind of just shows the lack of knowledge. Similarly, when, so many doctors, even psychiatrists, still don't really understand autism. Right. So even some people who their whole job is the body, like physios and sports physicians, don't get it.
Right.
And, this is just the explosion of information that's helping many of our lives, because getting access to these diagnoses and these answers, all it does mostly is validate our experience and help us get better, more appropriate and accessible healthcare and lives.
So
yeah.
how were you tested for hypermobile EDS, if not a blood test? Yeah. No, not a blood test. So, and a lot of people do still get the blood test to check that they're not one of the other types. But I'm a very black and white case of HEDS. So my rheumatologist was like, I don't think you need the blood test. I'm confident you're HEDS and not any of the other EDSs. So already seeing a rheumatologist might be a hint.
Well, so the 2 people that can officially diagnose it, at least in Australia, are rheumatologists or geneticists. And I had actually seen 4 rheumatologists before I got my EDS diagnosis, not seeking an EDS diagnosis, but with all my chronic pain stuff. And the last two that I'd seen, I had mentioned EDS because I'd started to become aware of it, but this was before I saw the rheumatologist that specialized in EDS. And they both dismissed me. One said that I couldn't because I wasn't hypermobile enough, which there's a thing called the Baton score. I can send you a link to show people who are interested, but you need, I think, 7 out of 9 to be considered hypermobile as a kid and 6 out of 9 as an adult. And there was one thing I couldn't do. I think I'm 6 or 7 out of 9. I'm just enough to be considered hypermobile, but I also had an injury, so I can no longer do the wrist touching on this hand. And he said because I wasn't hypermobile in every joint that I couldn't be. And the other one said I couldn't be because my skin wasn't stretchy enough, which is, it is one of the symptoms of Ehlers-Danlos, but it's only for a couple of the types. And again, just shows the very much lack of information. But in my mind, as a lawyer, when you go to see a, let's say, family lawyer, they're not going to give you property law advice. Or a family lawyer who specializes in divorce is not going to give you advice about domestic violence. I'm sorry, I don't want to trigger anyone, but and I'm not a family lawyer, but I'm just trying to use an example. It blows my mind that health professionals are confident to say anything outside of their specialty. So the two rheumatologists that told me this had no background in EDS. They were pain specialists who specialized in physical injuries that I was seeing from my car accident. And they were absolutely not known as being EDS. Similar to, I have a blood condition called factor V Leiden, which is a genetic thing as well. Means you're more disposed to blood clots. And when I was pregnant, I went to see a hematologist just to get advice on how to manage the pregnancy and make sure I didn't risk anything wrong with me or the baby in blood clots. And they were very dismissive because I was only heterozygous, which means 1 and not 2 genes of it, which they weren't wrong, but they didn't take into consideration all the other factors, including me being a fat person and the influence that weight has on increased risk of blood clots and a few other things. And then I later found out, and this was like many years ago now, so like smack on the back, Annie, for not doing your due diligence, but now I do too much of it, is I have been trying to get, so I'm going through fertility issues right now. I've been quite public about them, secondary infertility and multiple miscarriages. And I'm currently about to go and see another hematologist. And this time I've specifically gone and found one that specializes in genetic blood clotting disorders. So I'm hoping that that means they're going to at least understand the more complex nature, because, and a lot of the stuff I do is in healthcare accessibility, more than probably employment, and definitely more than in the education space, because I've had so many health problems. I've faced so many health barriers, and I've struggled to advocate for my needs as someone whose entire job was to be an advocate. Like, I was trained to, I'm a brilliant debater, not to toot my own horn. I love arguing. And I still had trouble. So that's kind of what started me going into this space, is like, I need to help others, because if I struggle with it, then what chance in hell does anyone who doesn't have the privilege of a law degree or a career that has enabled them to have these skills, right? What were we talking about? Yeah. So anyway, the EDS, the rheumatology. So yeah, I just find it really strange that these doctors would have said that I couldn't possibly have it without even doing the actual full test. So luckily by then I was very aware of how there are quite a few doctors out there who don't know a lot, especially in certain areas. So I was very much, I didn't let it bother me. I would have if it was the years before that. But I went and finally saw this rheumatologist who specialized, and it's basically like they go through your entire history, checking everything from, have you had dislocations, joint issues, chronic pain, and then they do like a full physical and check all your joints and everything. And it's not that complicated, but they also do like an EKG and a few things just to mostly check for POTS and dysautonomia and a few other things that can be common with EDS and even autism. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. I think I digressed a bit. No,
it's fascinating because it's something I've been looking into myself, because I've have had, I had similar to you. Was very, very flexible as a child and used to be able to do weird hyperextensions. And I actually lied to people and said I had dislocated my shoulders, even though I never dislocated my shoulders, but I acted like my arms did things that you couldn't explain why they did, right? And so I just made up this story as a child that I had dislocated my shoulders, which never happened. But I could, I had a lot of issues like that. And now as an adult have significant joint problems and was just going through this whole health scare with it was just this health issues with my neck and shoulders, and I had lost hearing and I had vertigo, and I was going to all of these doctors who were different specialists, and they were so siloed. I was going to ENTs, I was going to an osteopath, I was going to an oral surgeon, trying to figure out what was the root cause of the dizziness and the hearing loss and the vertigo, and it turned out it was all related to my neck and
yes,
and my shoulders,
and
that's where EDS came up, because I was like, what? Yeah. And then finding out that this was actually quite common with neurodivergence, where I'm like, oh my goodness, another thing.
Here we go again.
But I wasn't able to make that connection because I was like, why? How would something that is primarily in our tissue and our joints relate to our brain? But you explained it much better than the internet has. So no, well, I mean, I hope so. No, it's interesting you say that, because with my car accident, I basically, when it happened, I didn't go to hospital immediately or anything. It didn't seem that bad. My car wasn't written off. I thought this is going to, I didn't think I'm going to have, 4 years of chronic pain and a bunch of surgeries. That's for sure. But, a few months went by and the whiplash that they said would improve didn't. And then a year went by and it didn't get better. And then other things started popping up, like really bad TMJ pain on my right side. It was all on my right side, right neck, right jaw, right shoulder, right wrist. And then the wrist got worse, and it was just like nothing was helping. Tendinitis, and some even made it worse. Yeah. So I eventually and this was only actually after I had my son. So in the last 2 years, but it was when he was very, very young, like newborn. I started seeing a physio that wasn't a specialist in EDS, but she understood it enough that she wasn't ignorant of it, especially hypermobility. And she had some extra training than most physios get in, I don't know specifically what it was, but it was something to do with really having that focus on the human body about how connected it is. And a lot of physios will treat like one injury and just that area. And she was very much seeing what linked to each other. And so what we ended up finding through me seeing her is that most of my wrist problems and jaw problems were coming from my neck. And because most of the issues I'd had in the years before was my shoulder was my worst thing, and then my jaw, no one really looked at my neck that much, beyond acknowledging that it was still stiff and maybe the whiplash never really fully went away. Anyway, long story short, I have gone from living in really severe chronic pain for years to very, very, very mild. I don't want to say cured because it's not, but my pain has gotten so much better. I don't have any of the issues to the extent that I did before. And most of it is truly just finding a physio that would treat my body as the unique body that it is. And God, I wish we could find doctors in every area that did this, right? Where they weren't so siloed and specialized that they didn't know about any of the other stuff, that when you're facing a neurodivergent patient, guaranteed we're complex patients. We are not your cookie cutter textbook in any way, from our pain response to our healing ability, so many different things. And I think it's really, really not good that currently doctors are not trained in that area. And I think that in the future, we're heading to a space where it's going to be in the core of medical training, because there's just so much damage happening from people going in to see every kind of doctor and them not being aware of all these differences. Yeah. And how to adapt their treatments. Well, I always joke that I'm like, if you find talking to medical professionals to be traumatic, then that is your diagnosis right there.
Yes, that's so true though. It's so true. I mean, I'm sure people listening are going to be like, everyone finds that traumatic, but like truly traumatic and difficult. And you know, you definitely want to look into it.
Well, I even, you know, I've said this on the podcast before, like even when I was diagnosed with ADHD, I was not only was I fumbling with all of my paperwork, but I was like, you have to say out loud to me that I have a combined ADHD diagnosis, or because I will always leave. If you don't say it right now very clearly to me, I will leave and always worry that I misconstrued the conversation, or like the amount of just like feeling like
explicit, literal, direct communication,
right? Yep. But also just the like how bewildering it is to be in that environment. It's so overstimulating, and to get this information and then just be thrust out into the street. I'm always like, did I hear that correctly? Did I not? Do I remember this? Do I not?
Yep.
Like, you know, now I'm very good about getting everything in writing and not just like nodding and being like, but like, you know, realizing that so much of that experience is so overstimulating that a lot of us just stumble out of a doctor's office just being like, what just happened? Like that.
Yeah,
that's the diagnosis right there. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that. It's so true. So true. Sometimes I even, these days, if I'm pretty stressed about it, I'll ask the doctor if I can put my dictator on, which is one of the assistive technologies I use quite frequently.
Yeah.
Mostly just for my working memory and, you know, making sure that I know what's being said and I'm not questioning what I think I heard, and then I can go do my own research. And there's a whole bunch of reasons, and not every doctor's open to it, but most of them are pretty fine with it if you explain that that's why, and it's not just to get on the record of stuff that you may use against them one day.
Right, yeah. But, you know, again, that's...
because they're all terrified of lawsuits.
No, that's
especially
true.
If you're a lawyer.
Well, no, I think that's also tells you how I've been able to advocate for myself and have a sense of humor about it, where now I'm just like, yeah, I'm not going to remember anything you just said, so you're going to need to write that down. Like, there's no shame there. There's no sense of like, I'm so sorry.
And use humor if it helps.
Right?
Like,
yeah.
Whatever you need to get that access, whatever makes it easier for you to articulate it. I just think and the other thing is, just going full circle back to ADHD and autism and overlapping is, when you do talk about things like how you struggle with maybe social skills or keeping relationships or whatever you want to call it, no matter what any of the quote unquote symptoms, or what I prefer to say traits or characteristics are, it's really important, I think, to look underneath them and to try, and it's not an easy thing to do, and you're not always going to get the answers the minute you do this, but to try and figure out what's the motivation. So like, do you struggle when you go out with your friends to like communicate with them because you're so distracted by the noise and sensory overload? Or is it because you're distracted because you're just distractible? Or is it because maybe they're not using very literal language, or not talking about your interests, your special interests, so you're a little bit like, oh, do I have to make small talk? What are the reasons behind it? And it's not necessarily that you need to know them, but it helps to know them in terms of just understanding yourself better and feeling like you don't have to fight it as much, or even being able to articulate it. I think a lot of neurodivergent people attract neurodivergent friends. I have had friends in life that didn't stay in my life very long because I was never the type of friend that could catch up regularly ever. So all my really good friends in life have been the ones that I can disappear for 6 months and then come back and we can have a really long lunch or dinner, and it's like we never were apart. And they're mostly neurodivergent. Anyway, but it's interesting. Yes.
Well, I was just going to say, I was blown away from the Neurodivergent Woman podcast when they were talking about the relational versus informational conversation and how that kind of falls between neurodivergent and neurotypical. And it's been really interesting to think about that and to notice it in real time. And one of the things I remember really being very confused about was gossip. Gossip was something I never was into. I'd never understood it, and I felt very uncomfortable by it. And so like I've just sort of looking over the course of like female friendships, especially that for me is like a marker where I was like, every time I would be around women and they would start to gossip about other women, which I think is a very relational tendency, I was always very like, why are we wasting our time doing that? Like,
this is so mean and boring.
And it was, it just seems so awful and unnecessary, and I could never understand why I found it so awful. And now I'm like, because it's terrible, but also like I could never really decide the difference between that kind of gossip where you're just talking shit about somebody, or just being like, isn't it interesting that this person does this, right? Where like I'm like, is that also gossip? Like, and I find that is so much more informational, right? Which is like, I'm trying to figure out who this person is and what makes them tick. And so I don't know.
And being curious and not nasty.
Right. Yeah. And so I found that really interesting to me, thinking about all of these friendships and the difficulties I had with a lot of female friendships coming down to the relational versus informational. And that was so enlightening to me to think about like where that breakdown was and why when two neurodivergents are speaking, even though we've just met, we're like magnets, right?
Yes.
And so this idea of like, do you enjoy meeting new people is such a problematic question, because I'm like, it 100% depends.
Mostly, maybe not, but sometimes, yeah.
Okay, so
so true.
I have two more questions for you.
Okay,
thank you for hanging out with me. So
that's okay.
I really want to know about. Okay, first of all, I want you to explain the title of Princess and the Pea, because it's such a great. I love the explanation you give for why you called your podcast The Princess and the Pea. So can you, for my listeners, can you elaborate a little bit?
Yes, I can. I won't do as good a job as I did in my trailer, so go listen to that.
To the trailer.
But, in a nutshell, that was my nickname from my family as a kid. I was Princess and the Pea. My adult nickname from my husband is Goldilocks, because things can't be too much or too little of anything.
Wait a minute. I'm starting to think we're in a lot of fairy tales, right? A lot of...
I think we are much more than people realize. But yeah, Princess and the Pea was mostly my dad's nickname for me, because I was just such a sensitive child, like emotionally sensitive, physically sensitive. In every way I was sensitive. And I used to have a lot of shame about that. Now I'm like out loud and proud. I think sensitivity is beautiful. And I think some of the most amazing people in our world have high sensitivity. I could speak a lot about the HSP right now. I'm a highly sensitive person, but listen to my podcast. Yeah, mostly. But anyway, so I was very sensitive. And so when I was choosing a name for my podcast, I was similar to you in the sense that, well, I wasn't similar to you because I knew I had autism and ADHD, but I was similar in terms of like, what do I want to talk about? And I didn't want the word autism or ADHD in it just because I didn't want to have both. Because that's not a great title. Like, it's just not fun, right? It's boring. I don't want to. If anyone's podcast is titled that, I'm so sorry. I probably listened to it. Oh, I'm so offensive. Anyway, so I was like, well, what's a fun title that is also one that my people would connect with? And I think I was like, well, Princess and the Pea is something that's stuck throughout my life. And so in my I think it's my first episode, I explain the story of Princess and the Pea, of, you know, the princess going to the castle and the queen testing her for her son, and not that, you know, it's misogyny and all that crap, but she sleeps on this pile of mattresses and puts a little pea underneath, and in the morning she wakes up and she's got bruises all over her body, and the queen is like, oh my God, you're real, you're authentic, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, so for me, it's very much a signification of sensitivity being a positive, first off. Not a negative, which it so often is seen as in our world. But also it's like taking it back. It's like the word fat. Like I'm fat positive. I'm a firm believer of fat liberation. And I use the word fat as a neutral descriptor. And I don't use the O word because that's pathologizing. And there's so many problems with it. Anyway, so it's similar. Like I'm taken back sensitive. I am a highly sensitive person. I am an autistic person. I am an intense person. I'm an overexcitable person, all the things. So that's Princess and the Pea. And it's basically me talking to cool people who are similar to me or can help people like me.
And in typical fashion, I was, when I first discovered you, I was like, I'm going to listen to every single episode in the next 24 hours.
You'd be surprised how many people message me and say that, how they've binged the whole season. I'm like, oh, you poor thing, listening to my voice for that long.
Well, we listen to it on 1.5 speed, so you know, it's fine.
Oh yeah, that's good. That's quicker.
It's so good. Oh my gosh. And I'm like, how do I, there's so many great episodes. Just go binge it. It's so great. Are you working on?
Thank you. Season
I was going
2
to say,
starts
what's
very
going on?
soon.
I didn't want, it's been a while. So I was worried that you had moved on to other things.
It has. No, God, no. I'm actually halfway through season 3 recording.
Good. Okay.
But season 1's the only one that's live. I was meant to put season 2 out, I think, in October, but that's when my miscarriages started. So, and also I was like doing 1,000 things, and it just wasn't the highest priority because I also had a not-for-profit that I started last year on eating disorders, and we were getting a lot of amazing segue with that. So I was like throwing all my energy into that advocacy work, and the podcast just got put aside. But it didn't get put aside in the sense that I have kept the interviews going. It just got put aside in the sense that I haven't quite finished editing and putting intro outros in, but I'm almost there now with season 2. So that'll start coming out at the end of March, which I'm so excited about because people have been wanting that, but that it's coming. But something that I do talk about on my podcast or socials is the fact that I am anti-consistency. I think consistency is a neuronormative value and bullshit, excuse my French. And it is absolutely something that I have never prescribed to, and I've tried to before and still failed, and now I openly reject it. And I mean, I hope in doing that I give others permission to do so too, because so much of our lives is trying to fit what people see as a good thing, whether that's consistency or productivity or blah, 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 things that are not super accessible to neurodivergent brains like ours. So I think, as much as I would love to be a very consistent podcaster, that's never going to be me. But you can come and binge a season here and there. Like, it's coming. It's still happening. It's just going to come out in a very neurodivergent fashion.
Well, and plus, you've even just in this conversation, you've mentioned you've got a book coming out. You're still running Edna. Edna is the eating disorder.
Yeah, no. So I've officially stepped down in January, which they're still kicking it, and my 2 second in commands are like legends. But I got what I wanted out of it, and that sounds very selfish of me. I got what I want out of it, so I ditched them. No, it was more, the reason I founded Edna, which was last May, was purely to make sure that the first national eating disorder strategy that's coming out in Australia in August highlights and includes neurodivergent people, because we had a strategy come out in 2021 that was the first Australian, this is going to be painful to hear, it's a long name, research and translation strategy on eating disorders. And we don't have enough time to get into that, but I'm sure I've talked about it on other, actually, I think it's in my second last episode of season 1, I talk about eating disorders. But basically they barely mention us. And then at the end, there's like a little sentence on page 60 that says that there's an emerging link between ADHD, ASD and eating disorders. I'm like, emerging since the 80s is not emerging. Early 80s. That's almost a decade before I was born.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was my sole purpose, because a lot of the people that are in Edna and helped me create Edna, we were all doing so much advocacy in this space, but not getting a lot of traction. So I was like, let's just join forces. And then they listened, and we have made some huge leaps just in that first 6 months. So I was comfortable enough come Jan that I was like, you guys have got this. They were happy. And I was also I'm still ongoing dealing with the fertility stuff, and my own business that was also on in the background, and my own advocacy work. And I've got like 1,000 things going, like who doesn't? Very AuDHD of me. So I've stepped down, but I'm still their number 1 fan, and they're kicking butt. Our podcast, Edna has a podcast called Neurospiced with a capital ED at the end. And I interviewed an amazing guy, Max, in, I think it was October. And that episode should be coming out this month, I think. So that's also delayed. But they've been putting out a couple other episodes that are lovely.
Okay.
So
I'll
go
put a
listen
link
to them
to that in the show notes
if you want to dive in. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and then but you're also working, you're also coaching, or? Okay, so how can people find you?
Mm-hmm. So, so my website is anniecrowe.com.au, but I'm mostly on LinkedIn and Instagram is my main favorite platforms, and my Instagram handle is _Annie Crowe, Crow with an E. But yeah, go to my website, go to my socials, connect. I obviously, I'm almost finished my first run through of my flagship course, Autistic Empowerment, which is a 6-week online program. But we'll have another round of that in a couple months. So I've got a wait list going. I think it's on my Linktree. But that's sort of maybe a third of what I do is the coaching stuff, because I do that course, but I also do one-on-one, mostly helping people with advocacy or navigating our NDIS disability system and that sort of thing. And then the other stuff I do is I speak a lot at conferences, and I do a lot of training to health professionals and employment places on neurodiversity, access and inclusion. I'm speaking at our National Suicide Prevention Conference in May on autism and suicide. I've been hounding our national body for 12 months. Every time they put a post up, I'm like, these are the stats for autism and ADHD. So they're like, oh, you want to speak? I'm like, oh, okay. I do a lot in the mental health space because with all the eating disorder stuff, obviously suicide is something that really heavily impacts our community. And especially if you have eating disorders or any other co-occurring mental health illness. So I'm very passionate about neurodivergent mental health, both in getting support, but also people understanding the differences and all of that stuff. So I've got my finger on a lot of pies. And the 2 books I'm writing, one I started when I was pregnant with my son, who's 2, which was on autistic pregnancy, mostly because I Googled it and thought, oh, I'm going to have such an advantage because I found out I was autistic before I had a kid, which most women to this day are still not finding out until their kids are diagnosed. And then I looked up autism and pregnancy or autistic pregnancy, and there was like 1,000 articles on how to avoid having an autistic child. And I was like, really? There's one positive book on autism and pregnancy, but it's quite a bit old now, but it's still good, by a doula, I think, in the US. I can't remember the name of it right now, but anyway, but I wanted to do one that was more from a healthcare advocacy point of view about like how to navigate the health system in pregnancy from an autistic lens. But obviously ADHD will be included. It's just, I kind of consider it all one.
Is it?
It's all merging for me these days. It's who knows? But like, I'm both, so I'm not as focused on breaking them up anymore.
All right. Well, I'll have to learn. I'll have to lean into that.
I hope.
No, it doesn't help.
Anyway,
That's
I'll send you a bunch of links. Oh yeah. Damn it. But yeah, then my other book, which is probably coming out before the pregnancy one,
Neuroaccessibility,
is the Neuroaccessibility book. And so my website is I've got 3 websites. One's for the podcast, one's my main one, and one's the Neuroaccessibility one. And they all have kind of different purposes. Look, I'm not going to apologize for my intensity. But Neuroaccessibility, it's a brand new website, just .com. It's kind of what I'm trying to do that's more of a external focus. So my anniecrowe.com.au is more me supporting the neurodivergent community in my coaching and advocacy stuff. And then the Neuroaccessibility is sort of my attempt to educate the world on how to be inclusive and accessible to our brains. So that's more of that external facing bit. And so it's very early days of setting up that website. But I'm hoping to build a whole bunch of resources and things that people can use or send their bosses or employees and to understand stuff in a neuroaffirming lens, and really basically practice what I'm trying to preach and also practice myself, which is to spin it on its head and really focus on the true crux of what everything that we struggle with and are dealing with is, which is creating an accessible world and not trying to fix ourselves, because we're not broken. We're just different, and that is valid to get help for. So yeah, include us.
Okay.
But no, I love chatting to you.
Thank you so much,
Thanks
and thank you for taking this extra. Anytime, are you kidding me? I'll be so excited.
Yay!
So okay, so my last question is, what would you call ADHD something else if you could? Did you come up with a name, or do you love love attention deficit disorder?
No.
You're like,
I can't stand it. And I don't even like saying I have ADHD. I prefer ADHD, but then like the grammar part of me is like, ugh, that sounds terrible.
I know, right? I don't like the ADHD.
But I prefer that just in the positive identity.
It's so awkward.
Neither, but we don't have an equivalent like autistic people have, as you were saying earlier. I don't have another one. There's heaps out there. There's like Dave
Vast,
and Wave
and
Vast. Yeah, Vast. Yeah, exactly. I don't particularly like any of them, to be honest, which is, I think, a really big part of why I lean towards autism in my work, is just because there's just so much out there on ADHD, and I don't like the fact that we don't have a better way of talking about it, which hopefully I can figure out. But that, and also from an Australian angle, right now, autistic people are all the rage in terms of, we've just had a big Senate inquiry last year on helping improve autistic life outcomes. So we should have our first autism strategy out in the next year or so, hopefully. We've just got our first state minister on autism in South Australia. Like, autism is all the rage, and autism has access to the NDIS. Well, most of us do. Some of us do, probably not most. I think we take up a third of the NDIS too, which is huge. Anyway, and yeah, I forgot what I was saying, but that's a great way to end. And that's the other thing is, like, it's, I used to really try hard to hide the fact that I would forget my train of thought all the time, and I'd try and figure out ways to move around it. But now I'm like, unashamedly, like, my brain forgets stuff all the time. And most of the time, the less I worry about it, the more it'll just pop back eventually.
Oh, exactly. Right. Yeah. And that's in this podcast, we leave all of it in. We leave the forgetting and the roundabouts, and
I'm not
going to cut any of that out, because it's how we think. It's how we communicate. It's how we talk. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think you've just got to show up as yourself for our community to see who we are, and that they can be themselves as well, like, unashamedly. Oh. Yeah,
it has. I'm so glad I got to do this. Is why I started a podcast, so I could have an excuse to reach out to amazing women like you.
Same. That was literally why I'm like, I want to just talk to all these people that I keep listening to and who I think are awesome and need to get their voices out there more. I love it. I love what we do, and I love our community, and it's beautiful.
Well, thank you, Annie.
Good. But yeah, I love ADHD, by the way, and I do a lot in the ADHD space. I just don't like the term, and because so many people I work with and help are autistic as well, I'm just like, it's just both. Like, I don't feel the need to differentiate as much. But in saying that, you do kind of need to, in terms of diagnosis and, people believing you and giving you access. So I'm not saying you don't have to care about the differences, and I still want to. It's more of an acknowledgement that it's really not super clear. And
well, for me, it's mostly a curiosity thing, right? Where it's just like, how do I make how do I make this make sense to me? It's the same thing with like EDS and the brain, where I was like, I don't get it until I do. And then I'm like, oh, okay, now all the pieces align. Right?
Exactly.
So that's what it is for me. And, and it's so fitting that when I was diagnosed with ADHD, so the podcast is called Women in ADHD, but now I'm like, I'm like, we're neurodivergent, and it all comes together. And I'm like, do I change the name of the podcast? Because I do feel like, I feel like it's a gateway. It's a gateway diagnosis.
I think it's a gateway. It is. No, and I also think it's just a gateway for, I'm on a lot of Facebook groups, and I really like the ones that are just ADHD and just autism. And I'm seeing in the last 12 months, it's really growing, that overlap that people are becoming more aware of. And I think it's really good to have those spaces. If your podcast was like that you have ADHD, I'd probably want to change it, but you're women and ADHD. Like, I think that's fine. I think that's great. And the fact that autism is so commonly also an ADHD's thing. Right. Cool.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think you have to change it. I like it.
All right.
It's good. And it's also why I found you all those years ago.
Well,
Because I was looking up ADHD and autism. That's why I'm probably losing out not having those in my title because people aren't looking for
I've
princesses.
admitted that in the past where I'm like, the single smartest thing I did was to name it Women in ADHD because I had no platform. I'm nobody. Like, I'm just sitting here in my living room. So it's like, that was because I wanted women who were immediately just Googling like I did. What is this? And what is ADHD in women? And that's how people found me. Yeah. Right?
That's exactly how I found you.
I did something right.
Exactly. You did.
This has been so
Katie.
great, Annie. You have not heard the last from me, I swear, because I'm going to keep stalking you.
Oh, me either. I'm gonna hold you to that. You're coming on my pod.
But thank you so much.
This might take like a year. I'm just so all over the place. But I know that you'll understand.
Right? You could call me in 2 years and it'll be like no time has passed. That is what we'll guarantee.
I will.
All
absolutely.
right. Yeah, let's